The old saying goes that the mountains keep their secrets. But on that crisp autumn morning in Montana's remote wilderness, Harold Miller was about to discover that sometimes the mountains choose to share those secrets in the most extraordinary ways. At 68 years old, Harold had thought he knew everything these ancient peaks could reveal. He was wrong. The first rays of sunlight crept over the jagged horizon, painting the sky in brush strokes of amber and rose as Harold's worn leather boots creaked across his cabin's wooden porch. His morning coffee steamed in the cool air, the familiar aroma mixing with the sweet scent of pine needles and morning dew. 5 years of solitude had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments, even as they reminded him of everything he had lost. Sarah would have loved this morning. The thought came unbidden, as it often did, bringing with it a familiar ache in his chest. His wife had always said the mountains looked most beautiful at dawn, when the world was still dreaming, and the light made everything soft and new. Now, instead of sharing these moments with her, Harold shared them with the wilderness itself. Their children never understood why he chose to stay in this remote cabin after Sarah passed. "Dad, you need to be closer to people," they would say, during their monthly phone calls. What if something happens? But Harold knew that the emptiness of the city would be far lonelier than the fullness of these mountains. Here, at least, the silence had meaning. His morning routine had become a ritual of sorts. Check the weather, tend to his small vegetable garden, and make notes in the leather-bound journal Sarah had given him on their last anniversary together. Write down the beautiful things, she had told him. This morning he wrote about how the spider webs between the porch railings had caught the dew, turning them into strings of diamonds in the early light. But today's entry felt different somehow. His pencil hesitated above the page as he noticed the unusual quiet settling over the forest. Normally, the dawn chorus of birds would be reaching its peak, a symphony of chirps and calls that he had learned to read like a newspaper. Their silence spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to listen. Harold set down his coffee mug and stood, his experienced eyes scanning the tree line. 20 years of mountain living had taught him that nature's silence was often its loudest warning. Something was different about this morning, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up despite the peaceful scene before him. He needed supplies from town. It was a 4-hour hike along the mountain trail, a journey he made every 2 weeks since his old truck had finally given up the ghost. Most people his age would have seen this as a hardship, but Harold viewed it as a blessing. The walk kept him strong, and out here, strength wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. As he packed his backpack with methodical care, Harold ran through his mental checklist: water bottle, trail mix, first aid kit, flashlight, and his old flip phone that rarely had service, but provided a small comfort to his worried children. Each item had its place, each one chosen through years of experience. Yet today, as he double-checked his supplies, an unusual urge made him add an extra bottle of water and more bandages to his pack. Standing in his cabin doorway, Harold took one last look around the single room that had been his sanctuary these past 5 years. Photos of Sarah smiled at him from the walls, her presence still filling every corner. "Just another supply run," he said softly to her image, but as he locked the door and set off down the familiar trail, the mountain silence followed him, whispering that this day would be anything but ordinary. The morning mist still clung to the valley below as Harold's footsteps crunched along the gravel path. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains were watching him, waiting. After all these years of keeping their secrets, perhaps they had finally decided it was time to share one with him. The mountain trail stretched before Harold like an old friend waiting to share its stories. Every bend and switchback was familiar to him, each one holding memories of the countless journeys he had made over the years. The morning sun had risen higher now, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy of pine needles overhead, creating patterns that danced across the dusty path. His footsteps fell into their usual rhythm, a steady pace that had served him well on these supply runs. Harold knew exactly how long each section of the trail should take. 30 minutes to the lightning-struck pine that marked the first rest point, another 45 to reach the stream crossing, 2 hours until the ridge that overlooked the valley. He had walked this path in sunshine and rain, through summer heat and early winter snows. But today, the familiar trail felt different. Harold noticed it first in the way the shadows seemed deeper, more watchful. The usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was absent, replaced by a stillness that made every snapping twig under his boots sound like a gunshot. Nature had its own language, and right now it was speaking in whispers. An hour into his journey, Harold paused at the lightning-struck pine. Its blackened trunk reached toward the sky like a gnarled finger, a landmark he had used to gauge his progress for years. He took a small sip from his water bottle, conserving it as experience had taught him. As he stood there, a pine cone fell. Nearby, the sound sharp and sudden in the unusual quiet. Harold's eyes tracked upward, following the path the pine cone had taken. No squirrels chattered in the branches above. No birds called their morning songs. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, creating the kind of silence that made his ears strain for any sound at all. In all his years on this mountain, he had never felt the forest quite so still. Moving on, Harold began to notice other signs that something was different. Fresh claw marks scored the bark of several trees, too high for a mountain lion but unusual for the black bears that sometimes wandered these slopes. Broken branches littered the path in places, torn off with force rather than fallen naturally. His experienced eyes read these signs like words on a page, and they told a story that made him quicken his pace slightly. The stream crossing came next, the water running clear and cold over smooth rocks. Harold normally enjoyed this spot, often pausing to watch the play of light on the water. Today he noticed something that made him stop mid-stride. The small animals that usually came to drink had left no fresh tracks in the soft mud by the water's edge. Instead, a single set of large prints told him everything he needed to know. Bear tracks. But not just any bear tracks. These were bigger than any he had seen in these parts and fresh enough that water was still seeping into the deep impressions. Harold felt his heart rate increase slightly, though his outward calm never wavered. He had dealt with bears before, had taught his children and grandchildren how to be safe in bear country, but something about these tracks made his decades of mountain experience prickle with warning. As he continued along the trail, Harold began softly whistling an old tune Sarah used to love. The sound felt almost intrusive in the heavy silence, but he knew making noise was better than surprising whatever was sharing these woods with him. Each step took him further into the strange quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, evaluated, measured in some way he didn't understand. The familiar trail stretched ahead, leading him deeper into the mystery the mountain seemed determined to share. Harold adjusted his pack, checked his surroundings one more time, and pressed on. Whatever was waiting for him, he would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried him through all the challenges life had thrown his way. It happened in the space between heartbeats. One moment Harold was alone on the trail, and the next, the forest around him exploded into movement. The massive shape emerged from the thick undergrowth with a grace that seemed impossible for its size, moving like a shadow given form and weight. Time seemed to slow as Harold found himself facing what he instantly recognized as the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen. The bear's fur rippled in the filtered sunlight, a rich brown coat touched with silver that spoke of age and survival. Standing upright, it towered over Harold at well over 8 feet tall, its massive shoulders broader than his cabin's doorway. But it was the bear's eyes that caught and held Harold's attention. They weren't filled with the mindless aggression he had seen in other bear encounters. These eyes held something different: intelligence, purpose, awareness. Harold's years of wilderness experience took over, pushing aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew better. His hands remained steady at his sides, his breathing controlled despite his racing heart. He had always told his grandchildren that panic was more dangerous than any wild animal, and now he lived those words. The grizzly dropped to all fours, and Harold prepared himself for the charge that would surely come. But instead of attacking, the bear did something that made Harold question everything he knew about these powerful creatures. It sat down. Right there on the trail, less than 30 feet away, the massive predator settled onto its haunches and tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. The forest around them held its breath, No wind stirred the branches overhead. No birds called warnings. The only sound was the soft whisper of Harold's careful breathing and the occasional gentle huff from the bear. Seconds stretched into minutes as man and beast regarded each other, locked in a moment that defied everything Harold had learned in his decades of mountain living. Then the bear did something that would forever change Harold's understanding of the natural world. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its right paw and placed it over its chest, holding it there for a moment before lowering it again. The gesture was so human, like that Harold blinked hard, wondering if the thin mountain air was playing tricks on his mind. But the bear repeated the motion, its eyes never leaving Harold's face. In all his years of wilderness encounters, Harold had never seen anything like this. Bears were intelligent, yes, but this was different. This wasn't just animal behavior. This was communication. The bear's eyes held an urgency that transcended the natural barrier between species, trying to convey something that Harold struggled to understand. As if sensing his confusion, the bear rose again and took several steps to the side of the trail. Then it turned back to look at Harold, waiting. When he didn't move, it repeated the action, moving a few steps further before turning back again. The message became clear. The bear wanted him to follow. Everything Harold knew about wilderness survival told him to take this opportunity to back away slowly and return to the safety of his cabin. Following a grizzly bear off the marked trail went against every rule, every instinct, every lesson he had learned in his long life. But something in those intelligent eyes held him there, speaking to a deeper part of him that recognized this moment as extraordinary. Harold thought of Sarah then, remembering how she had always told him that the greatest moments in life came disguised as choices. Choices between safety and discovery, between fear and trust, between turning back and pressing forward. Her voice seemed to whisper on the still mountain air, encouraging him as it had so many times before. The bear waited patiently, its behavior so far removed from everything Harold knew about these powerful predators that he felt like he had stepped into one of the fairy tales he used to read to his grandchildren. Yet this was real. The bear was real, and somehow, Harold knew that what happened next would be a story that few would believe but he would never forget. Standing there on the familiar trail that suddenly felt so foreign, Harold faced a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The massive grizzly bear waited at the edge of a narrow game trail, its patience remarkable for a creature known for its fierce and unpredictable nature. Every survival book Harold had ever read, every wilderness course he had taken, every bit of mountain wisdom he had gathered over his 68 years told him to stay away from bears, especially grizzlies. Yet here he was considering following one into unknown territory. The bear made another soft huffing sound, almost like a sigh. It took a few more steps down the game trail, then turned its massive head to look back at Harold. The intelligence in those eyes seemed to say, "Trust me." Harold found himself thinking of all the times in his life when trust had seemed foolish but had led to something extraordinary. The day he had first asked Sarah to dance despite being sure she would say no. The time he had left his city job to move to the mountains, everyone telling him he was making a mistake. His hand tightened on his backpack strap as he took his first cautious step forward. The bear's response was immediate and remarkable. Its ears perked up and its posture relaxed slightly, as if relieved that Harold had finally understood. It moved forward with purpose now, but at a pace that seemed deliberately measured, careful not to outstrip its human follower. The game trail wound through parts of the forest Harold had never explored, despite his years in these mountains. Thick undergrowth pressed in on both sides, and the canopy overhead grew denser, creating a green twilight even in the morning sun. Harold maintained a respectful distance behind the bear, close enough to keep it in sight but far enough to react if something went wrong. Though with each passing minute, the idea of something going wrong felt less and less likely. The bear moved with surprising grace for its size, occasionally pausing to look back at Harold, sometimes making soft vocalizations that seemed almost encouraging. Harold found himself talking quietly, not out of fear, but from a strange sense of companionship. "Never thought I'd be following you," he murmured. "Sarah would never believe this one." Time seemed to lose meaning as they traveled. Deeper into the wilderness, Harold's experienced eye noted landmarks, mentally mapping their route even as he marveled at the strangeness of the situation. The bear seemed to understand the need to rest, pausing in small clearings to let Harold catch his breath. During one such break, it sat down and watched him with what could only be described as patience while he took a drink from his water bottle. The forest around them had changed. The silence that had seemed so ominous earlier had transformed into something different, something almost reverent. Small animals still kept their distance, but birds had begun to call again, their songs creating a gentle backdrop to this unprecedented journey. It was as if the forest itself had accepted this strange partnership between man and bear. As they pressed on, Harold realized something had shifted inside him as well. The initial fear had given way to a sense of wonder, and beneath that, a deep certainty that he was experiencing something profound. He thought of the journal entry he had written that morning, about seeing beauty in unexpected places. If he made it back to his cabin, this would be a story that would fill pages, though he wasn't sure anyone would believe it. The bear paused again, this time lifting its nose to the air and letting out a low sound, unlike anything Harold had heard before. Something had changed in its demeanor, a new urgency in its movements. They were getting close to whatever the bear wanted him to see, and Harold felt his heart rate increase with anticipation. Whatever lay ahead would explain this extraordinary behavior, this impossible trust between predator and prey. He adjusted. His pack took a deep breath and followed the bear around a bend in the trail, knowing that his world was about to change again. The game trail opened into a small clearing, and Harold's heart nearly stopped at what he saw. There, in a shaft of sunlight breaking through the canopy, lay another grizzly bear. This one was smaller than his guide but still impressive in size. Its powerful leg was caught in the cruel steel jaws of an illegal trap, the kind that had been banned in these mountains for decades. The sight filled Harold with both sadness and anger. The trapped bear was conscious, its eyes bright with pain and exhaustion. Dark stains on the ground around the trap told Harold it had been struggling, for hours, maybe even since the previous day. The bear that had led him here moved quickly to its companion's side, making soft, almost cooing sounds that seemed to calm the injured animal. In that moment, Harold understood everything. This wasn't just any bear his guide had brought him to help. This was its mate. Harold's throat tightened with emotion as he watched the uninjured bear gently nuzzle its trapped companion. The level of intelligence and devotion he was witnessing defied everything he thought he knew about these creatures. Somehow this bear had not only recognized that it needed human help, but had specifically sought out and trusted him to provide that help. The steel trap was an old model, its rusty mechanism partially hidden by leaves and debris. Harold had seen similar ones during his younger days working with the Forest Service, when they had spent weeks clearing the mountains of these brutal devices. This one must have been forgotten or deliberately hidden by poachers. The sight of it brought back bitter memories of other animals he had found too late to save. Drawing on years of wilderness experience, Harold carefully assessed the situation. The trap's spring mechanism was powerful enough to break bone, and one wrong move could snap it shut again or worse, catch him in its steel grip. The trapped bear was obviously in pain and frightened, which made the situation even more dangerous. Even with its mate's apparent trust, Harold knew he was dealing with wild animals in a desperate situation. The uninjured bear seemed to sense his hesitation. It moved away from its mate, creating a clear path for Harold to approach. This behavior was so far removed from normal bear conduct that Harold found himself questioning reality again. But the rusty metal trap and the injured bear's labored breathing were all too real. Harold took a slow step forward, then another, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy now," he murmured, the words meant for both bears and himself. "I'm here to help." The trapped bear watched him with wary eyes but didn't struggle or show aggression. Its mate remained at a distance, watching intently but maintaining a posture that somehow managed to convey both trust and warning. The morning sun had climbed higher, its light filtering through the trees to illuminate the clearing in a way that made the scene feel almost sacred. Harold found himself thinking of Sarah again, remembering how she had always told him that love was the greatest force in nature. Looking at these two bears, seeing their devotion and trust, he couldn't help but agree. In all his years in the wilderness, he had never witnessed anything like this. With steady hands that belied his racing heart, Harold set down his backpack and began to assess how to free the trapped bear. He knew the next few minutes would be crucial, requiring all his skill and courage. One wrong move could spell disaster, but doing nothing was not an option. These bears had placed their trust in him, and he was determined not to let them down. With the delicacy of a surgeon and the determination of a man who knew lives hung in the balance, Harold began the dangerous work of examining the trap. The rusted metal teeth had clamped down on the bear's lower leg, and while the bone didn't appear to be broken, Harold could see the ugly wound where the steel had torn into flesh. The bear's mate watched from a few yards away, its massive presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. "I'm going to help you," Harold spoke softly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But you need to stay very still." As if understanding his words, the trapped bear remained motionless, its dark eyes fixed on him with an almost human-like awareness. Years of mountain living had taught Harold that animals could sense intention, and he poured every ounce of his desire to help into his gentle movements. The trap's mechanism was old but still deadly efficient. Harold knew from experience that simply trying to pry it open would be impossible. The spring holding the jaws shut was powerful enough to snap bone, and one wrong move could cause it to clamp down even tighter. He would need to trigger the release mechanism while simultaneously preventing the jaws from snapping shut again. Sweat beaded on Harold's forehead as he carefully cleared debris from around the trap. Each movement was measured, deliberate. The injured bear occasionally made soft whimpering sounds that tore at his heart, but it remained remarkably still. Its mate paced quietly at the edge of the clearing, making occasional huffing noises that seemed to comfort its trapped companion. "Sarah," Harold whispered to himself, "I could use some of your steady hands right about now." His late wife had been a nurse, and he had always admired her calm presence in crisis situations. Drawing on her memory, he took a deep breath and began the delicate process of manipulating the trap's release mechanism. The first attempt failed, the rusted spring refusing to budge. Harold's heart raced as he repositioned himself, knowing that each failed attempt increased the risk of something going wrong. The trapped bear tensed but didn't move, showing remarkable trust. Its mate let out a low sound, almost like encouragement. Minutes stretched like hours as Harold worked with the mechanism. His hands remained steady, but his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. He found himself talking continuously in a low, soothing voice, words flowing without thought. "Almost there. You're doing great. Just a little longer." Then, with a sudden loud snap that made both bears jump, the trap's jaws sprang open. The injured bear quickly pulled its leg free, but instead of running or attacking, it simply lay there, exhausted. Harold scrambled backward, putting distance between himself and the two powerful animals, his heart pounding in his ears. What happened next would stay with Harold for the rest of his life. The uninjured bear approached its mate, gently nuzzling the wounded leg. Then, to Harold's amazement, both bears turned to look at him. The larger bear, the one that had led him here, made direct eye contact and once again placed its paw over its chest, holding it there for several seconds. The gesture was unmistakable. A thank you. Harold stood motionless, overwhelmed by the moment. The morning sun had fully illuminated the clearing now, casting everything in a golden light that made the scene feel dreamlike. The injured bear slowly got to its feet, favoring its wounded leg but otherwise appearing strong. Its mate stayed close, supporting it as they both began to move toward the edge of the clearing. Before disappearing into the forest, the bears paused, one final time, looking back at Harold. In their eyes he saw something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Intelligence, gratitude, and something more. A connection that transcended the usual boundaries between humans and wild animals. In the quiet aftermath of the rescue, Harold found himself doing something that would have seemed unthinkable just hours before. With gentle movements, he pulled the first aid kit from his pack and slowly approached the injured bear again, The wound needed cleaning, and somehow, incredibly, both bears seemed to understand this. The larger bear, which had shown such remarkable trust in seeking his help, stood nearby watching with those intelligent eyes that had first captured Harold's attention. Its injured mate remained still, only occasionally flinching as Harold carefully cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes from his kit. The trust these powerful creatures were showing defied everything he had ever known about wild animals. "This might sting a bit," Harold murmured, his voice soft and reassuring as he applied antibiotic ointment to the deep cuts left by the trap. The injured bear made a low sound but didn't pull away. Its mate responded with a gentle huffing noise. That seemed to provide comfort. Harold found himself thinking of Sarah again, remembering how she had always said that pain was easier to bear when you weren't alone. As he worked, Harold noticed small things that amazed him. The way the bears communicated with subtle movements and sounds, how they seemed to understand his intentions through his calm voice and careful actions. The injured bear's patience as he wrapped a light bandage around its leg, not tight enough to constrict but enough to keep the wound clean until it could heal naturally. Years of mountain living had taught Harold to respect wildlife from a distance, to see bears particularly as powerful creatures to be admired, but avoided. Yet here he was, tending to one while another stood guard nearby. The experience was changing, something deep inside him, shifting his perspective on what was possible between humans and wild animals. The morning had warmed considerably, and sunlight dappled the clearing as Harold finished his work. He packed away his first aid supplies, movement slow and deliberate. The bears watched him with an awareness that went beyond mere animal instinct. There was recognition there, understanding, and something that could only be described as gratitude. Standing up, Harold spoke to them one last time. "Take care of each other," he said softly, meaning every word. The larger bear made that now familiar gesture again, paw against chest, while its mate slowly tested its bandaged leg. The wound would take time to heal, but Harold knew these creatures were survivors. They had already shown him that they were far more than just wild animals. What he had witnessed and experienced in this clearing would stay with him forever. The lure, intelligence these bears had displayed, their capacity for trust, their obvious devotion to each other all challenged his understanding of the natural world. In his 68 years, Harold had seen many remarkable things in these mountains, but nothing quite like this. As he prepared to leave the clearing, Harold realized that while he had helped save the injured bear, these magnificent creatures had given him something equally valuable in return. They had shown him that the wilderness still held mysteries, that trust could bridge even the widest of gaps, and that love and intelligence could be found in the most unexpected places. The journey back to the main trail felt different somehow, as if the forest itself had changed, or perhaps it was Harold who had changed. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns on the forest floor that seemed to dance with new meaning. His original mission to get supplies from town was forgotten, replaced by something far more significant. Every few hundred yards, Harold noticed signs that reminded him his experience had been real. Fresh bear tracks in the soft earth, broken branches that marked their earlier passage. Once he even caught a glimpse of movement in the distance that made him smile, sensing his new friends were making sure he found his way safely back. As his cabin came into view, Harold paused to take in the familiar sight. The wooden structure, that had been his solitary refuge for 5 years, now felt different. The wilderness around him was no longer just a beautiful backdrop to his quiet life, but a living community filled with more intelligence and emotion than he had ever imagined. Inside his cabin, Harold sat at his small table and opened Sarah's journal. His hands trembled slightly as he began to write, trying to capture every detail of the extraordinary day. "My love," he wrote. "Today I learned that miracles don't always come in the ways we expect. Sometimes they come with fur and claws and teach us that love and trust know no boundaries." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Harold heard a familiar huffing sound in the distance. Stepping onto his porch, he smiled at the 2 dark shapes moving along the tree line. The bears paused briefly, the larger one making that now familiar gesture one last time before they disappeared into the gathering dusk. Harold knew he would see them again, and that his life in these mountains would never be quite the same. Did this story touch your heart? There's so much more waiting to be discovered. Real stories like this one happen every day, each carrying its own magic, wisdom, and unexpected turns. Please subscribe.